So if we review some of these things that we've seen, when we're looking at now this question of an evaluation scheme like this, not from the top down, which is to say a sort of straightforward view of how it might optimize firm outcomes by doing things like establishing monitoring controls and boosting productivity, but from the lateral point of view, from the point of view that is triggered by our evaluation of the Roman grain trade, which is to say, how can you control for agency costs absent effective monitoring mechanisms? And that, in turn, invites us to ask the question, where do people's primary incentive lie? When we answer that question, that people's primary incentive lies in avoiding termination, when we see the consequences from that, what does that do for firm outcomes? A firm that systematically discourages risk-taking, a firm that discourages the clustering of talent, a firm which encourages its employees to identify a kind of baseline metric relative to the performance of their peers and work to that. So there seem to be any number of reasons why perhaps you might end up with suboptimal outcomes as a result of a scheme like this. This we would call the critical perspective on management, because this is a management decision, is it not? Right? This is a decision that management takes in order to control for agency costs within the organization. No good manager is going to show up to work one day, Monday morning at 9 a.m. and say, what is the best scheme that I can think of to discourage my firm from taking risks, to ensure that talent in my firm stays well apart from one another, to try and foster an environment in which no one wants to collaborate with anybody, to try and set up a benchmark where people identify the bare minimum they need to do in order to get by and won't do much more, where people are kind of pissed off, nervous, and anxious all the time. What's the best way for me to achieve that for my organization? Because that sounds pretty great. No one's going to say that, right? Which means that people who have put this system in place are unlikely to have thought about it from this lateral point of view. In other words, they're unlikely to have thought about the agency problem in the way that the Roman grain trade case invites us to think about it, which is, how do I establish trust, reputation, positive incentive? Instead, they're thinking top-down, what is the best monitoring scheme that I can put into place in order to keep those costs minimized? But when we look at it then from that first point of view, from that lateral point of view, we start to see any number of unintended, perhaps unintended, outcomes. So why do firms do it? Why do so many of the world's leading firms implement a scheme like this? Jack Welch in 2000, I believe, when he was the CEO of GE, wrote in his letters to shareholders, they have a scheme like that, and he said it's fundamental to our firm's success. That this is one of the ways that we can retain our competitive advantage, maintain the edge that we have in the market. Why would someone like Jack Welch, a very smart guy, why would he, in a letter to his shareholders, identify this, take the time to actually single this out as being one of the reasons to explain GE's success? What do the firms think they're achieving with this? And I think the point is that they're looking at it from a results-driven perspective, which places the agency cost in the wrong way. And because of that, it's not clear that in fact the outcome that they want to achieve is actually being achieved. Well, that's not a problem, you say. No worries. Given how many companies do this, given how pervasive this is in a firm environment, there must be an abundance of evidence out there that indicates firms that employ a curved evaluation scheme do better than firms that do not. And yet, when you go into the literature, what do you find? Don't do this. You can go to Amazon and type in employee appraisal, and what will come up are any number of books saying, drop this form of employee appraisal. Don't do this. It creates bad results. Mostly, I have to say, gathered on anecdotal or impressionistic evidence from disgruntled employees who are all unhappy that they've been part of that 20% being invited to look for other jobs. Well, that's okay. Because perhaps there is, on the other side, some robust statistical evidence from social scientists showing optimal firm outcomes for those firms that choose to employ this scheme. But when you go looking into that literature, what you find is that the few studies that exist that discuss this exist purely using baseline models. There are no real-world examples that demonstrate optimal firm outcomes using a force-rank distribution scheme. And even those studies, which based on models predict perhaps a boost of productivity in firm performance, find that that productivity boost is limited. It lasts for maybe a year or 2 years, which makes sense, which is to say, once you've gotten rid of all the dead weight, your firm's performance will be enhanced. But thereafter, you don't see, or you don't predict, according to the model, any particularly substantial improvement. So it's odd, isn't it? Here we see this thing which has basically become a kind of common currency for managing agency costs, unsupported by substantial literature that demonstrates unambiguously optimal outcomes, and indeed challenged by a not insubstantial amount of accumulated evidence that says it doesn't work very well. Why then do we still see this being practiced by so many firms? What could possibly explain why some practice, which affects the lives of many, many people, why should it then be so widely implemented? I'm going to suggest to you the answer to that is, one, it just seems like a good idea. If I go to you and I say, look, I've got this great scheme, and you're going to be able to constantly promote talent and constantly remove slackers and complacent employees, and you're going to be constantly rejuvenated, and you're going to send great signals to the market, and it's going to lead to wonderful results, what are you going to say? Well, I'll do that. That's perfect. That's exactly what I'm trying to achieve. And if I don't tell you it's true, you won't be taking risks anymore, and your employees won't want to collaborate, and they'll all hate you. Are you then likely to adopt it? And the answer is yes, because all you'll see are the positive outcomes that occur. And I suggest the reason why so many firms do it is essentially a network effect. Once one firm starts to do it, you'll start to see many firms do it because it creates a kind of fear. Good heavens, the guy down the street is now stack ranking his employees. I better do that too. Otherwise, I might lose my competitive edge. And that network effect seems to have taken hold. And so what we find is that an essentially unproven idea has taken hold of, or has become embedded as a good management principle for controlling agency costs. Despite the fact that our Roman grain trade case would predict that it's a bad way for controlling agency costs, because the Roman grain trade case suggests you don't need that kind of coercive monitoring mechanism. Instead, you want mechanisms that foster trust and reputation amongst your employees, because that's the best way to align incentives. Incentives that are aligned through fear of being fired are not going to be as effective as incentives that align based on a desire to produce or to participate in a shared reputational mechanism. I can't tell you, because we don't have the evidence, whether in fact unambiguously one is better than the other. But if you compare firms that do employ stack and rank, like Microsoft, and you put them up against companies that don't, like Google, it's not clear, I think, to any of us that we're necessarily seeing unambiguous better performance in one than the other. And so absent clear empirical evidence that this should be the case, it invites us to go back and to question, why do we do this? And if we simply do something because it seems like a good idea, without considering why it's a good idea, from every possible angle, and only implementing it after we have made that consideration, we are not engaging in good management practice. That is an example of management failure. And this is what we need to avoid. This is what firms need to avoid. They need to avoid that kind of failure. And you avoid that kind of failure by coming at the questions, at the problems that you need to solve in the widest and most informed way possible. If you simply look at something from the top down and you forget to consider it from other perspectives, you are unlikely to be able to project all of the potential consequences for the decisions that you're taking. And yet, that is the role of a good manager.